Hello and welcome everyone to our inaugural episode of Tetrate Tech Talks. My name is Eitan Suez. It is 9 o'clock Pacific time. I am actually located in Austin, Texas, so the time here is 11 a.m. Feel free to go ahead and throw in a message in chat and say hello. Tell us where you're coming in from. And we've got an exciting show for you. This is our first episode of a new broadcast that we're launching here at Tetrate by the name of Tetrate Tech Talks. And I would be remiss if we didn't also have a landing page. Let me share with you this landing page that we've put together that I'm going to walk you through a little bit what this episode is about before we begin in earnest. We've got a few surprises for you as well. So what you're seeing on your screen is the landing page for the Tetrate Tech Talks. I'll share with you the link in just a moment. And this is episode 1. And I've gone ahead for the sake of transparency, posted to this website all information about episodes. Upcoming episodes will be published on this website as well. And even our little presentation, since this is a tech talk, we're going to do things in a tech way. And that also includes using Markdown for our presentation. I actually even prefer going even more techie and just falling back to a text editor and to as my guide to talking to you about this episode. So this is a new series of broadcasts. We're going to be running this on a weekly basis, and we're broadcasting live to YouTube and LinkedIn Live. So just want to say welcome, everyone. What are these Tech Talks about? They're about learning and sharing knowledge and geeking out to a great extent and getting to know each other as a community, right? So the goal will be to bring on guests, and we have a couple of guests with us today. I'll be introducing them shortly. But above all, the objective is to have fun as we talk about different technical topics around Kubernetes, Service Mesh, and many other topics. All right, so our surprise is the fact that I managed to steal a little bit of our CEO's time, and I want to bring him on. He's going to I would like him to have a chance to say hello to the community, to talk a little bit about what this broadcasting is before we begin. So let me bring him on. And Varun, you are live. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And what I wanted to ask you was at least give you the opportunity to say hello to everyone and tell us a little bit about what this is all about.
Awesome. Thank you, Eitan. Excited to be here. And so for those of you who may not know me, I'm Varun. I'm one of the co-founders for Tetrate, but have been in the community for a long time. And prior to this stint, I was at Google, where a bunch of these projects started. So I was fortunate to be in the driving seat, both for gRPC project as well as for Istio project. So I think I have been feeling the community when pre-COVID, when we used to meet at every cloud native conference and meetups, and used to see all the people and engage with them. And with the COVID world, we felt like that constant engagement and touch is somewhat getting lost. And how much can you keep doing Slack messages?
That's so true.
Right. So the need was being felt to how can we be in touch? And when I say in touch, more like discussing topics that really matter, and getting people who are knowledgeable in the community to share more broadly, be it about any of those cloud native topics that we work in, we care about. Could be about Kubernetes, could be about service mesh, could be about what's happening in cloud native security. So there's a lot going on in the community, and there's so many people that we know and so many people who are trying to adopt and have opinions, have challenges, and how can we create a more thriving community this way. So the idea is more engagement in and we want to do this. That's why weekly be there and have interesting people be here who can share more knowledge, and in that process we all learn, right? So that's the goal, and I'm excited to see this format go live, and feel free to give us feedback on the format, the topics you would want. I'm sure Eitan will provide links on how to do that, and so looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Varun. I really appreciate it. Yes, so you've heard it. We really want to hear from you. We'll show you in just a little bit how you can reach us, the different ways in which you can reach us. We're going to do this weekly, a very frequent cadence, which I think will be a great way for us to touch base and explore technologies together. Thank you so much, Varun. I'll let you go. I'm sure you're quite busy, and we'll proceed with the broadcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eitan.
Bye. Okay, so let's carry on. Thank you so much for this introduction. Who am I? My name is Eitan Suez. I am your host for this episode, and I work at Tetrate, and I like to talk tech. And I figured, if we're going to spend time together, I owe it to you. You should know a little bit about me, where I come from. I mentioned that I live in Austin, Texas. It's a beautiful spring day here, by the way. The bluebonnets are in full bloom, and it's just a lovely day. And I hope I find everybody doing well. Likewise in your neck of the woods. Hopefully, all of the issues with lockdowns are going to be behind us in the rearview mirror, so to speak. But just a little bit about my background. I'm basically a techie. I got my degree in engineering years and years ago. And made the switch from engineering to software very, very quickly back in the 90s when coming out of school, when I sort of saw the writing on the wall and the internet was in full bloom back then. I remember Netscape introducing its first browser, my first job as a systems analyst at the University of Texas, building mainframe applications, if you believe it or not. So I've seen a lot of technology changes, and I'm still excited by it after all these years. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm sure you'll have plenty of chance to get to know me better over the coming weeks. So here's the URL to the Tetrate Tech Talks. Maybe I'll show it to you here as in a web page, rendered in a web page. I already mentioned that this is where we're going to be posting information about upcoming episodes. So what's in this episode? We have a topic that we're going to discuss about service meshes, and specifically a subtopic, how to connect VM workloads to the Istio Mesh. And we also have a guest, which I'll be introducing later after we do our tech talk on connecting VM workloads to the mesh. Bart van Bos is with us, all the way from Belgium. So I suspect it'll be about 30 minutes from now that we'll begin our interview in earnest. Okay, so let's go on to our next sort of subject. Tetrate hosts a number of free workshops. We started sort of cranking them out a couple of months ago. We have a workshop that we just delivered a couple of days ago called Istio 0 to 60. If you're new to service meshes and you want to learn about service meshes, this workshop may be for you. The best thing is these workshops are free. We run them monthly and we advertise them. So the next one is scheduled for May 4th, but the contents are available online, and you can go through these yourself. So if you're thinking, I want to learn more about service meshes, it's just a matter of clicking on a link and following the instructions. So these are the labs that comprise the workshop. And likewise, we have another workshop called Wasm, WebAssembly. How do you extend Envoy with WebAssembly? So that's another workshop that I want to put on your radar. All right, and this is I think a really busy time for us in the industry. A lot of great things and interesting things are coming up. The first one that I want to bring up is IstioCon 2022, which is an online event which is going to take place the week of April 25th through 29th. And there's the link to it. Let me go ahead and pop it up on screen so you can see more or less what the landing page looks like. And they just published the program for the conference So, and I believe the registration is free, so definitely there's no excuse for not joining. So that's IstioCon. I want to put that on your list of things to look forward to. And we have a number of veterans who will be presenting at the conference as well. And I expect to be conducting a workshop there as well. Also in May, we've got the big conference, ServiecMeshCon and KubeCon EU coming up in Spain. And Tetrate will be running its own one-day event with keynotes and talks and announcements. So definitely stay tuned for that and put another item on your calendar to basically look forward to the announcement, and hopefully you'll be able to maybe even participate and join us in Spain for that event. And then finally, if you happen to be in my neck of the woods in Austin, Texas, we're just begun organizing a sort of maybe a half-day event called the Austin Roadshow, scheduled for April 21st, and stay tuned for more information on that. Another thing I want to let you know about is we have a Tetrate community Slack channel that anyone can sign up for, and it's just a great way for you guys to chime in. You're not locked into the chat that's bounded to this particular broadcast. And let me just pop that up in a web browser just to show you what that looks like. I've even created a dedicated channel for the Tetrate Tech Talks. So if you have comments and feedback for me, just come over here and chime in. Also, if you're working through one of our workshops and have questions, we've got a Slack channel for that. And what else? Also, if you're preparing for maybe taking the Certified Istio Administrator exam by Tetrate, yes, Tetrate has a certification exam for Istio, which is terrific. If you have questions about it, we have a Slack channel for that. Okay, let's get back to our little presentation here. And enough of announcements. Let us carry on and start talking about the topic of our episode proper. So the topic that I've chosen is about connecting VM workloads to the Istio Mesh. And I should mention that here we go. I've got a link to this particular demonstration and tech talk that we're going to be doing. But I should be remiss if I didn't mention also the fact that many of you who might have been with us longer know that we have another set of episodes called Istio Weekly that comprise, I would say, at least 20 hours of tech material that, if you're thinking, I want to ramp up on Service Mesh, this might be a kind of a niche topic. Don't worry, we've got you covered. There's plenty of information there. So let me introduce you and essentially orient you to what we're going to do. This is, I think, a great exercise, and not just in terms of an exercise, but also giving you an idea of the versatility and extensibility of this platform that we're working with. So the subject is connecting VM workloads to the Istio Mesh. And since we're talking about Istio, where does this actually come from? I want to map this information for you to the Istio documentation. So if you peruse through the Istio documentation, look at this install link. Under the installation guides, there's one particular guide that we're focusing on here, which is called the virtual machine installation. And the instructions that we'll be going through in this demo are essentially a specialization of these instructions here for a particular use case. All right. And one of the there's a diagram here that talks about the particular architecture of how to achieve this, which I'm going to keep sort of bookmarked over here in a separate window, which is going to be the beginning of our conversation. So what are we looking at here? We're talking about deployment topologies and deploying Service Mesh. And there are a number of different ways in which we can deploy Service Mesh. We can do it in a multi-cluster fashion or a single cluster fashion. I'm going to keep things simple here for the sake of this demo. We're going to go with a single network and a single cluster. And what you see here is a layout of a service mesh that includes virtual machines. So on the left-hand side, we have a Kubernetes cluster. We have Istio installed. You see istiod, that's the control plane for our service mesh. And we see a pod there with the Envoy sidecar indicating that our service A is participating in the mesh. But we also see there a gateway, which allows essentially communication at the control plane layer with external virtual machines where other services could run. And so this is a very realistic use case. Maybe not about all of our workloads are ready to be containerized, and Istio has a provision for this by allowing you to onboard essentially a VM and have that VM become part of the mesh. So you can have some of your microservices on the Kubernetes cluster proper and some outside it. And what we're going to do together is we're going to build this picture, which is going to be kind of fun. And I've decided, since I am conducting this memo, that we're going to do this from scratch. I think this is going to be terrific and a lot of fun. And so the other piece of the puzzle, what I want to talk about, is the fact that there is a canonical set of microservices that's well known in the service mesh community called the Bookinfo application. And here you see more or less the sort of the topology of this particular application made up of multiple microservices. It's designed really to highlight how in a microservice architecture you have a lot more latitude in terms of the tech stack that you can use. So the front-end microservice there, the product page is written in Python, and there's a product detail service written in Ruby, and 3 versions of a review service written in Java, and finally a 4th microservice called ratings written in Node.js, and they can all work together and cooperate, which is terrific. And so I thought, why not take this as our sort of the basis for our demo and see if we can pry apart one of the microservices. I'm going to pick on the ratings service. We're going to deploy ratings to a VM. So the basic idea is we're going to pretend like the rating service is a service that we want, for whatever reason, to keep running in a VM while the other services run on a Kubernetes cluster. So without further ado, let's begin and make some headway on building this picture. All right, so I'm going to step down to our terminal here. On my terminal, I've got the usual command line applications installed. The gcloud CLI. I happen to use the GCP. Is going to be the cloud that I'm going to use for this infrastructure. And if you want to follow along, all of this is actually directly available. All of the artifacts associated with this demo are available here directly. So if you just go to the GitHub repository for this page, which is rendered on GitHub Pages, it's just a matter of cloning this repository, navigating to the episode, and clicking over to the demo, and all of the artifacts you're going to need are all over here. Okay, so you are free to follow along at any time. And what I'm going to do is do exactly that. I'm going to start working on this. So what is this first command that I'm about to run? Let me show you. If we look at the, make sure I'm in the right place, Docs episode 1, demo. Okay, so if we look at the first script that we're going to run, it's just a simple gcloud command to create a simple Kubernetes cluster in GKE with 3 nodes in the default network. All right, so that's baking. And while it's baking, let's look at what our next step is going to be. And since I think the best way to do this may be to just, I'm going to try to give you guys a little more real estate, see how that works. And we're going to put these, my terminal and my instructions, side by side. Just a sec to get that done. So here we go. And yeah, we're going to put this on the left-hand side. There we go. We've got our instructions on the left and our terminal on the right. So our instructions on the right and our terminal on the left. So we're creating a Kubernetes cluster. And the next thing we're going to do is create a VM, right? We need a cluster and a VM. And on that VM, we'll run the rating service. So let's go ahead and run this separate command. And, hopefully the font size is big enough. Maybe I'll turn off my cam so I don't obstruct the view here. Okay, but don't worry, I'm still with you. And so here we have a VM that's running. And the thing that I want you to pay attention to is when I create this VM, I give it a name, but I also tagged it. The tag name is Mesh VM. And by tagging it, that's going to allow us to also create a firewall rule, which will allow network communication between the VM and the pods on the Kubernetes cluster. We'll do that in just a minute, but we also need to configure this VM. We need to go ahead and install the rating service and so on. So why don't we make some headway there? In my Bookinfo folder, there is this ratings subfolder, and I'm going to SCP the files from the ratings subfolder over to that machine. That's what I'm doing next. And once I've SCP'd those files, let's go ahead and SSH onto the machine, gcloud compute SSH. And then this is a Debian machine, Ubuntu image. It's not a Node.js image, so I'm going to go ahead and real quickly do a sudo apt-get install Node.js and npm so that we have our tech stack sort of installed on the VM, ready for us to run the rating service, which is a Node.js application. All right, how's everybody doing so far? I don't see any comments in the broadcast. Don't be shy. Feel free to comment and ask questions as we go through this, if I can clarify any of these points for you. So I'm doing an npm install here. And as soon as this finishes, what we're going to have is a folder with our Node.js application. Sorry, I'm doing an apt-get install. We'll be doing an npm install in just a minute. And we'll start the application on port 9080, which is the canonical port that the Bookinfo application uses. A lot of these decisions are somewhat arbitrary, but they really help with consistency. All right, so as Node is furiously installing itself there in that lower left-hand quadrant, we are going to, in a moment, install and run this application and test that the application is actually running. Okay, so if we go back to our little diagram here, what we're doing is we're configuring this VM here on the right and deploying the application, the service C that you see in this picture, essentially, is what we're doing. All right, and at the same time, our Kubernetes cluster is being provisioned. Okay. And I think we're almost done with both of these. Great. All right, so now I've got npm and Node.js installed. If we look in the ratings folder, is the ratings app. We'll do an npm install. There we go. And now that our dependencies are essentially with us, I should be able to do a node ratings.js on port 9080, and I'll run it in the background. Okay. And then we'll try this curl command. My fingers are not yet loose enough. All right, so the curl command actually worked. What we're seeing is we're making an HTTP request to a running service, and we're looking for the ratings for a fictitious product with ID 123, and we get back some JSON, which is telling us that reviewer 1 gives us 5 stars and reviewer 2 gives it 4 stars. So our application is up and running, which is terrific, which is one less thing to worry about. And here's the next step in terms of allowing. Now, this is interesting. Let me help sort of explain what we're doing with this next command. What I'm doing is capturing an environment variable, the CIDR IP address range. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, I'm on the wrong machine. That would not help. Okay, so I want to. Maybe I'll get off this machine for now and run this. All right, so what I'm doing is capturing the IP address range for the pod IP addresses for the Kubernetes cluster that's still coming up. Actually, I maybe should have waited for the cluster to finish coming up, but it looks like that part of the cluster is already up and running. There we go. Okay, so my timing was close to impeccable, if I might say. So why do we do that? Why do we capture these IP addresses? To run this particular command, which is basically going to create a firewall rule that basically says any pod in that IP address range that is from my Kubernetes cluster should be able to communicate on port 9080 to my mesh VM. Okay, so that's an important step. So we've just done that, which is great. So we have a firewall rule. And we also have a Kubernetes clusters. Let's check. We've got a 3-node cluster. Super. And we're going to look at namespaces. And the next thing we need to do is install Istio. So let me speak to this next command here. Okay. So this is, when you look at this command, there really isn't much to it. It's Istio cuddle install. So that's the default profile, but there's a couple of flags that we have to turn on. And I should mention that if you follow along with the proper Istio documentation from the Istio website, there will be a warning there, or a caveat, that some facets of this task are still denoted as experimental. And that basically means that it's in the process of being matured. So what we're doing here is we're turning on a couple of configuration flags saying we want workload entry automatic registration and workload entry health checks. So what is that about? Okay, so think of workloads, right? Whether they're running on cluster or off cluster, they need to register with a mesh. And this is a mechanism that's going to turn on some kind of automatic registration. We'll see this in action a little bit later. All right, Matt, thank you for your comment. Matt mentions here, I'm going to see if I can put it on screen. Yeah, Matt is saying this is helpful to watch live. Nice work, guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Matt. Okay, and so here we go. We're installing Istio with these flags. Okay, it's kind of dealing with. I want my font size to be large enough for you guys to be able to see. At the same time, I'm struggling with a slightly small real estate, but no big deal. So Istio is installed. How do we check that Istio is installed? Well, we can look at our namespaces, and you can see the Istio system namespace. And if we look at pods in Istio system, we should see istiod and an ingress gateway, which are the default components that get installed with the default profile. Terrific. So now that we've got Istio, what's the next step? Let's look at our picture again, right? If we look at this picture, what we've got going on, maybe I'll make this bigger. Yeah, what we've got going on is we've got our cluster and we've got istiod. We don't yet have these services running and we don't have this gateway. So that's what we're going to build next. And we also need to make sure, configure an Envoy on our virtual machine that's going to act as the sidecar for our rating service. But our rating service is running. So we're slowly building up this picture. All right. Let's carry on. Okay, so what are we doing here? We're labeling the default namespace for Istio injection. That should tell you essentially what my next step is going to be, which is to, I'm going to go ahead and close this so we can see better. Labeling the default namespace for Istio injection means we're about to deploy the other Bookinfo services. So there's a reviews service. And there are 3 versions of the review service, as you could see here in the what's being echoed on my screen. Not only there's a cluster IP service being created, but there's a reviews v1, v2, and v3, and a corresponding service account. And there are other services besides. Bookinfo REST is what I called it. These are straight out of the samples from the Istio documentation. So we see here the Bookinfo detail service and the product page service, but not the rating service. So if I look at our pods, we could see details, product page, and reviews, but not the rating service, because that's going to run on a VM. And notice that our sidecar injection is working. Every one of these pods has 2 containers, the main container proper and then Istio Proxy, which is the Envoy sidecar. All right, now I'll digress for just a moment. If we look at that reviews service, I want to point out one thing I did, which is also important to know about onboarding VMs. When you onboard a VM to the service mesh, there's this sort of mapping of that workload to a particular namespace. So I had to make a decision in terms of what namespace to associate with my VM. And I decided that I'm going to create a namespace called ratings and expose that workload entry inside that namespace. And so the Kubernetes domain name, or your host name rather, Kubernetes DNS is going to arrange for the host name for our rating service to be something like ratings.ratings.service.cluster.local, which in hindsight, maybe I could do a better job there, but that's what it's going to be. Which is to say, this Bookinfo application has a convention where all services expect to find each other in the same namespace. So I took a little look under the curtains at the source code for the review service. And it turns out the review service has an environment variable called services domain, which you can set, which basically can tell the review service what namespace the rating service can be found under. And it'll then use the right host name. So I wanted to sort of share that with you guys. All right, so good. We're filling out our picture. We need our gateway, right? So let's go ahead and create our gateway. So this is, again, another sample script from the Istio documentation, which creates what we call an east-west gateway. We use that term to create a contrast between sort of north-south traffic, which is ingress from, say, the public internet or customers or what have you, to ingress from the side, so to speak. So we've got our gateway, and you can actually see this gateway. Bigger. Okay, get pod-n Istio system. It gets installed into the Istio system namespace by default. You see the east-west gateway is right there. And why do we create this gateway? It's essentially to allow what we call control plane traffic between the Envoy running on the VM and on the one hand, and istiod running on the cluster. So what we need to do is expose istiod to the gateway. And if you actually look at the YAML here, it'll make a lot of sense. If you're familiar with Istio, you know that the way that you expose things through some form of ingress is with a gateway CRD and the virtual service CRD. And notice all we're doing here is exposing the destination istiod on the right ports for that control plane traffic to be able to navigate. Another thing that's sort of maybe worthwhile pointing out in this picture on the right that you see here is that green arrow that you see across the top. That is that traffic, service-to-service communication is not going through that gateway. It's just the control plane traffic that is. Okay, let's carry on. I promise this won't be too long. I hope you're still following along with me. So we're building that picture. So the next thing to do is that mapping between the namespace and the workload that's running on the VM. So we need to create a namespace called ratings and a service account. Why a service account? Does anybody? Hey, I see a hello from Gerasimos Mitropoulos. Thank you for joining us. I hope I didn't mispronounce your name too badly. So question is, why do we create a service account? Remember that in Service Mesh, service account plays a vital role in being part of the SPIFFE identity of every workload. So even these VM workloads are able to participate in the mesh fully with mutual TLS and so on. So we need to create that service account. So we've got a namespace and a service account. And all right, here's the VM specific bits that we're finally getting into. There's this concept of a workload group. And what's nice is that there's an Istio command, Istio CLI command, that can help you with that. It can help you create your workload group YAML, which is a custom resource. And if you follow the Istio documentation, they will tell you that the workload group is sort of like a template for workload entry, almost like a deployment can be a template for a pod, I suppose, or at least it has in its spec a pod template as well. And here we specify essentially that our workload is going to reside in the right namespace, have the right label, and the right associated service account. So this is the idea of a workload. So once we've got this YAML file generated through this command, we can simply apply it to our Kubernetes cluster. And here we go. We've got our workload group in the ratings namespace. All right. Now, how do we actually deploy and configure Envoy or the Istio proxy on the VM? There's a number of artifacts that you must generate, configuration files, YAML files. There's other concerns that I'm about to explain as well. And what's nice is that the Istio command, the Istio CLI, gives you a command to generate all the files you need, which is great. So this command says, go ahead and configure everything I'm going to need for a workload based on that workload group.yaml and generate a bunch of files in this VM files folder. And also, by the way, we want auto registration to be turned on. So what are all these files? These files are going to have to be copied onto our VM and put in the right places. Okay. Let me begin explaining what they are. So if we just look at cluster.env, it looks like a whole bunch of configuration that basically tells Istio maybe where the service is going to reside, or the sort of mapping again to the right namespace and the right service accounts. So a lot of that is in this env file. And then we've got a hosts file, which when you think about it, let's look at services. Let's look behind the scenes and try to understand this. In Istio system, we've got our east-west gateway, has an IP address 35.239.689. Notice that matches what we put in the host file, and that's because on a VM we're not running inside Kubernetes, so we use the host file as a mechanism to map the hostname istiod to the address of that east-west gateway. So that hopefully makes sense. Oops. VM files again. What's this Istio token? And I thought about it, and I realized that I've seen this before. And what I mean by that is for anyone who's ever installed Kubernetes the hard way, maybe with kubeadm, right? When you install Kubernetes, there's a particular procedure you have to follow. And that procedure involves setting up your control plane, your kube API server, and then adding worker nodes and having those worker nodes join your cluster. And when you do that with kubeadm, you have to also generate a token in order to securely have that node join your cluster. And that's exactly what we're doing here, except the node is the VM that we just created. And so there's an Istio token that has been generated by the control plane that we can use to hand off to our VM that will serve as its purpose to allow us to securely onboard that VM. So that's what that token is about. And then we've got a root certificate, of course, and a mesh.yaml config file. Okay. All right, so that's my sort of quick and dirty explanation of all of these VM files that we just generated through this command that we just ran on the right-hand side that you see here, that istio cuddle command that generated these files. Okay, so what do we do with these? We SCP them onto our VM. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll hop right back on our SSH back onto the VM so that we can. And I'm doing this manually, by the way, just for the sake of showing you how everything works. I guess if we had to operationalize this, we'll probably make a script out of it. So here I am back on the VM. There are all these files we were just looking at. And I'm just going to do this sort of quick and dirty. Go to the demo. And I'm going to go to the right section here in my text editor and follow these instructions. It's just easier for me to copy and paste a lot of this by using my little disk editor. So we're going to create a directory where we're going to put our root certificate, of course, that makes sense, and we're going to copy our root certificate to it, and then we're going to create this directory where our token, our Istio token, is going to reside. We'll put everything in the right places. And then we download the Debian package for our Istio proxy, and then we install it with the package. I hope I'm not going too quickly. Sangeet, welcome. Yes, it is a live show. Thank you for chiming in. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. All right, so we're installing the Istio sidecar. That's Envoy in a nutshell. And then we copy the configuration files to all the right places, the mesh.yaml and cluster.env. And then we are tacking on an entry to our host file. And finally, creating a directory for our Istio proxy and using a chown command to modify permissions on the file so that the Istio proxy service is configured and up and running. So on a VM, since we're outside Kubernetes, Istio proxy is going to run as a service with systemd. All right, so this is where the fun begins. We're going to do exercise 1, which is our first. Let's look at our picture again. So we've got, I think everything is in place. We haven't started this sidecar just yet, but I'm about to start it. And what happens when you do? We're completing our picture, and everything is going to sort of fall into place. So let's go look at exercise 1. Here we go. So I mentioned that the workload running on a VM is going to manifest itself in our Kubernetes cluster as what we call a workload entry, which is a custom resource in Kubernetes. Okay, and so one simple exercise that we can do, I'm going to open another tab so we can see this in action. We're going to run this command, which basically says, show me the workload entries in the ratings namespace. And at the same time, I'm going to start our sidecar on the VM. And as this service comes up, what we'll see, and it takes it about 30 seconds the first time you stand up the service, you'll see that the workload entry is automatically going to get registered with our service mesh, and it's going to show up here in the ratings namespace. And then, so one analogy that I wanted to make is you could think of that workload entry onboarded from the VM to the Kubernetes cluster as something that's akin to a pod running on the cluster. So it's a representation of a workload, right? But it's just not running on the Kubernetes cluster proper. All right, so we can also do, there it is. Okay, so there's our workload entry. And if you were really curious and say, okay, well, the name of the workload entry is interesting. It says ratings dash some IP address. You can bet that that IP address maps to the IP address of our workload, of our VM. So if I do a gcloud compute instances list, I know that this is not wide enough a view to display things. Oh, I'm in the wrong machine again. So let's do that again. Gcloud compute instances list. And if we look at our my mesh VM, that's the VM in question, and it looks like its IP address is 10.28.15.222, I think. If we look up here, it's the same IP address. All right, so our workload entry is running. So what does that mean? Does that mean that we can call services from the VM to the Kubernetes cluster? Let's test it. If I'm on the VM itself, can I do a curl against, say, another service running on the mesh, the detailed service in the default namespace on port 9080? And sure enough, I can. You see that? So that traffic is going through that sidecar, which is really cool, in my opinion. And we could do the same test in the reverse direction. Okay, so if we go ahead and create a cluster IP service in the ratings namespace, so kget service -n ratings, now we have a cluster IP service that's going to use essentially what I'm going to do here. Let me make this big so we can see better. Okay, so I'm going to rerun this command in wide form so you can see the selector for the service, app equals ratings. That's going to select our workload entry that's running on our VM, okay? Now that we've got that service, that means other services running in the cluster can actually call the rating service by that host name, by the service's host name. So if we create a sort of a temporary pod, so we can be inside the cluster, and from inside that pod, we run a curl command to call the rating service, we see the rating service answers. Let me do that again. We see a response, which means the rating service is answering it. I could do sort of the reverse test. We could do a psef grep ratings.js, and we could try to kill this process, right? Let's kill. And that if we repeat this call, you see here you get an error because the thing isn't running anymore. So let me run it again. Node ratings.js on port 9080. Let's run it in the background. Repeat that call again, and now it's working. You see the log from the rating service running on the VM is actually acknowledging that. Terrific. So we verified essentially everything, the communication from the VM to the cluster, from pods running on the cluster to the VM, and everything's working. So when we put it all together, and I'm going to pause for a second because I see a bunch of comments. I'd like to catch up to the conversation. How does the VM show up in the work group when you start Istio? Right, so Envoy is starting up, and it's got a configuration, and it takes that Istio token, right, and it basically registers with the mesh, and then I guess a lot of the sort of building of this feature essentially enabled this capability. Peter, I really appreciate you chiming in and answering that question. All right, so what if we just were to continue as if we were building just the Bookinfo application here, and applied the Bookinfo gateway? What does that do? That's an ingress gateway as opposed to the east-west gateway. So they're essentially the same bits. And that allows us to essentially have a gateway IP address, a public IP address. I just captured, so there it is. That's the IP address for the, so what exactly did I do? If you've done this before, if you've run the Bookinfo application, you know how this works. But basically, there's an ingress gateway that's part of Istio, and there are a couple of Kubernetes resources I just applied, which basically open up a port on that gateway that allows us to call the product page service running in our Bookinfo. So there it is. And so this is essentially our microservice, our application. And those stars that you see on the bottom are the review service making a call to the rating service, right? If I refresh this page, you can actually see the rating service echo that it was called, basically, right? You see that there. And sometimes you see black asterisks or black stars or red stars, and that's just a function of the different version of the review service being engaged at this point. So there's load balancing between multiple versions of the review service going on at the same time. So it all works, right? And if I just if I were to kill, if I did a PS again and killed this particular rating service, kill 580, we should be able to see the corresponding failure. And we refresh the page. Notice here it says rating service is currently unavailable. So so we definitely see the correspondence. The fact that it's what's serving the rating service is that workload on our mesh. Okay. All right, so that's the demo in a nutshell. There's one more thing that we could do, which is kind of fun, which is if we wanted to, and this is not actually in the script, we could run a second instance of the rating service on the Kubernetes cluster. So we can have a workload entry and a pod sort of be load balanced in terms of serving the rating service. And maybe I'll leave that for you as an exercise. Actually, or maybe I'll ask, does anybody want to see how that works? Okay, so our rating service is back up and we can refresh this page and everything's working again. So the way you would do this, let's look at that. In the Bookinfo folder, I actually have the rating service there. You see a Bookinfo rating service, and I could do a kubectl apply-f Bookinfo rating service -n ratings. So if I do a k get pod, and maybe I'll add, I forget if I need a comma there, workload entry -n ratings. You can see that we should have both. Let's see, k get pod -n ratings. Oh no, I didn't. So let me see what I did here. k apply-f. Okay, it's there. Yeah, I just am not looking. No resource to find the rating. Okay, so let me look at Bookinfo ratings. I'm troubleshooting that now. Oh, that's the service. I need to apply the pod, right? Okay. Bookinfo rating deployment is what it is. Okay, so now if I can get pod -n ratings, you'll see that in just a minute we should see that. Didn't get my namespace right. All right, it's running now, and so if I were to essentially now it's Istio injection is not there. I wonder if that's going to be an issue. But what we should see is that half the requests now go to the VM workload, and the other half go to the rating service. So if I could do a klogs -n ratings ratings pod follow flag, right? You should see the load balancing happen. So we can even have mixed workloads, which is what I'm trying to illustrate here. You can have some of them run on a VM and some run on the pod. All right, so that's the demo in a nutshell. Let us know what you think, if that made sense. By the way, you can run through this on your own. This is all public and available on our Tetrate Tech Talks website. So I'm going to stop right there and come back on and see if I can review some of the comments that are taking place right now. All right, so that's the demo. Let's talk about what we're going to do next in our episode. So we've got the demo, the presentation, and finally the interview with our guest who is patiently waiting. And I'm going to bring him up online in just a second. Just a moment. Our interview with Bart van Bos. Bart, allow me to introduce you. Bart is a colleague of mine who comes to you straight from Belgium. And I have high regard for Bart. I love listening to him. And when I said to myself, who should I bring on as an interviewee on the show, his name came to mind. And so I'm happy to have him join. And what I'd like to ask is, Bart, go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone.
Thank you, Eitan. So my name is Bart. I joined Tetrate around 2 or 3 months ago. I have a prior background in software development. The first 10, 15 years of my career, I was in software development in R&D, both as a developer, as a tester, as a software architect, and in the last years also as an infrastructure architect or an enterprise architect. I moved over to sales or pre-sales or solution engineering around 4 or 5 years ago. And I've been involved in the service mesh space around 3 years, a little bit before Istio 1.0 was released. I jumped on the bandwagon, let's say. And before that, I've done Kubernetes, cloud native, DevOps things for the last, I think, since 2014. So, yeah.
Wow. What's running through my mind as I listen to you say this is how early you sort of caught that wave. I'm kind of a late entrant, and I'm sort of amazed by everything I've discovered along the way. So my path was a little bit different from yours. I was started out as a developer, and then became more of a principal sort of solutions architect in the dev space, and was kind of a reluctant to be dragged into the world of DevSecOps, so to speak. And my journey started, obviously with cloud. When cloud came around, I got, I ramped up on that, and then I worked at Pivotal, and I was exposed to Cloud Foundry and platforms as a service, which was amazing. And then from there, hopped over to Kubernetes, and finally, after internalizing Kubernetes, getting to Service Mesh, it took me much longer. So Bart, I've got a number of questions for you. Let's begin with what we did in the demo. So I as I was thinking about this, our first episode, and what should we demonstrate, I picked this particular subject, and the question that is on my mind is, when it comes to the enterprise, how applicable is this? Is this a feature that a lot of enterprises need, or is this just another feature there that's just maybe not used very often? I know you're a little bit more exposed to the industry and the enterprise than I am, and wanted to ask you that question.
So first of all, I would like to say this is a very common use case, especially in large organizations. And I'm not going to name ex-customers or customers currently, but I have seen customers that had over 30,000 virtual machines as compared to maybe 10 Kubernetes clusters with maybe 100 or 200 workloads. So for many large organizations, the primary concerns are still VM. The money and money is made by data. The data still flows through virtual machines, and we are moving towards Kubernetes, and a lot of companies are doing this lift and shift. They are doing patterns where they break down the monolith and they kind of move over gradually to containers, but there is still this need for connectivity between virtual machines and Kubernetes. And especially because Istio, his roots is in Kubernetes, so everything originally modeled within Istio is with containerization and Kubernetes API in mind. What we now see for the last 1 year and a half is that VMs are taking more and more importance in the Istio space as well. And I think you demoed that very well. It is not a coincidence because the market is demanding and is asking for this. And I think one of the main reasons that this is happening is because the zero trust model and the certificate distribution, the distributed identity, the fact that you can have distributed identity, being client and server certificates rooted in SPIFE identifiers, distributed automatically to workloads. People in the VM world had this similar issue of machine-to-machine or service-to-service security. And it's something that I've always, because before I was in pre-sales, I was working as a consultant or as a freelancer. So I've seen a lot of companies in and out, and you would be amazed how many companies are still using username and passwords to authenticate a client to a server without any humans involved. Like a Jenkins that needs to authenticate to some, I don't know, Nexus or JFrog Artifactory or some other system. It's typically still username and passwords. And the reason for that, because certificates out there for decades, right? So not something new in server certificates, but the whole thing of distributing them and the lifecycle management in terms of revocation and recycling and issuing new certificates, that no company really ever got that really right. And now, because we are moving to containerization and everything is so dynamic, we have to get it right. So it's done the right way now in Kubernetes with Istio, and it's moving now. And people in the VM world see it's like, damn, they finally solved this. We also want to enjoy it. So that's why VMs want to be part of the mesh as well. And maybe later we can discuss what it means to be part of the mesh. But that's for me very important. And I've seen that from, and it's not only my opinion, I've seen that from customer ask, I see that from RFPs, from interesting talks with enterprise architects across the globe. So that's my 2 cents on that question.
Thank you. I always underestimate the value of, on the one hand, just reading through an idea, and on the other hand, actually practicing it. By going through this demo, I'm finally beginning to realize that if I took this idea to an extreme, I could install a Kubernetes cluster just for the sake of running Istio and have no workloads in Kubernetes and everything running on VMs. And the value add would be tremendous. In that, like you said, you could start taking advantage of all the things that the mesh gives you, specifically that notion of workload identity and the mutual TLS communication between the services and so on. All right, I've got another question for you. So as I reflect on Istio, some aspects of it really impress me. I mean, it kind of opened, I think I said this already once, it kind of opened my eyes a little bit, and it's a familiar friend in some way, and I didn't realize it at the outset before I really started digging into it, in that it tries to solve the same old problem, cross-cutting concerns, applications talking to each other securely, observability, and the list goes on. But I think this technology is still, it's already probably 3 years old or so, but I can still see a runway. I can still see maybe certain features that are not yet fully evolved or have come to full bloom, so to speak. And I wonder how this maps to enterprise needs. Are there like some things in Istio that work really well and that enterprises just sort of are able to turn on like that, so to speak? And maybe other things that require a lot more work to integrate and maybe that are not yet fleshed out.
Yeah. So it's really an integration question, because a service mesh is a middleware, and there are almost no greenfield scenarios out there in the world unless you're a startup or you're building something from scratch. You always have to interact with existing systems, right? And I know, just out of top of mind, there are like 5 to 10 different monitoring systems out there. And I'm talking about Elasticsearch, Splunk, Datadog, Sysdig. There are so many. So and every company has not only one, they typically have 2 or 3 or 4. So if you want to integrate Istio with them, you typically have a lot of integration work there. The same is with regards to from the security aspect. So you've got the public key infrastructure, your Vault or your Venafi or your whatever certificate authority you're using, maybe something in the cloud. Typically, you're going to integrate with that as well, because the base of trust from your cluster is Citadel, but Citadel can have its root of trust in, let's say, an external root CA as well, and that's how it is one of the foundations of Istio multi-cluster. So there is a lot of integration work there in terms of like, what if I want to rotate my root certificate of Citadel of my cluster once every 6 months or something? So there is some integration work as well. Integrations with external services, like your Postgres database, maybe a managed service on GCP or AWS or Azure or whatever, or your Kafka queue. Maybe that's you're consuming Kafka Confluent from the public cloud, or you have your own Kafka or similar queuing services somewhere on VMs. So this whole integration and how you bridge the certificate, or what I would say the security trust domain between those, these are typically challenges. Like many customers would ask us, what is the best way to connect a database to our workloads? Are we going to go directly from pod to sidecar to let's say external Postgres database, or are we going to put an egress gateway in the middle? And then what about the MTLS? Are we going to terminate MTLS and start a new MTLS connection with a different certificate set? And what about certificate management integration? So integration. And because there is so much diversity in terms of monitoring stacks, queuing stacks, there is a lot of.
I think you're making me realize that I guess that this was expression in English, the devil's in the details, and there's no lack of diverse systems that enterprises have been pitched and have adopted over the years. The heterogeneity of it all. It reminds me of something someone once told me. I used to do for a time some consulting at with a retail client in the Bay Area. And they said that basically their IT infrastructure was basically almost a museum of technology from the beginning of time to the end of time. They still had, their Oracle systems in there, and maybe even mainframe stuff out there, and it all had to sort of work together and be in harmony with each other, and that's no small feat. Okay, so my next question to you. Is about, so, and I think of Istio, there's always these four big categories that are maybe a good way of sort of thinking of the different facets of the technology. And you see it's really well done. Even the documentation of the Istio website it does things in terms of these four categories, observability being one of them, traffic management, security, and extensibility. And I think that's really well done. I can understand that. It makes a lot of sense to me. And my question to you is, in your opinion, what features of Service Mesh are the ones that provide the greatest value to enterprises?
That's beyond any doubt security. I would have answered that question 3 years ago differently. 3 years ago, I would have said observability. And the reason is simple, because like before the first time I installed the Service Mesh, I was working on a cloud native migration for a large Belgian bank, like really start from scratch, day one, start up the Kubernetes clusters in production, in dev, in QA, onboard the first 2-3 developer teams that are Java Spring teams. Okay, let's hook them up onto metrics. So let's build their Grafana and Prometheus dashboards. Oh, they want logging. Okay, make the Elasticsearch dashboards. So this was like a maintenance nightmare. And then after a few months, the machine learning team or the AI team wanted to come on board and Python, and everything was different. So the importance of having that service mesh abstraction and the fact that your sidecars are exposing a uniform set of metrics and logs is really important. So like 3 years ago, I would have said monitoring, but pure from a selfish fashion, because I was responsible for doing all that monitoring. But now I would say it is definitely security. So the fact that you have, like I've said before, distributed enforcement with a centralized governance plane, that's really important. And that's also where I see the most room for growth. So now there is a little bit of a discrepancy, or there is like a little bit of a confusion in the market, like the API gateway market and the service mesh market. There is a lot of overlap, and we have had our internal and external talks from Tetrate and the competition as well. And so there is a lot of overlap. I would say, like functionality-wise, there is maybe 70 to 80% overlap. But what is missing from the API gateway part being like the service catalog or the API developer portal where a developer can browse through a catalog and download the API specifications, even try in real time their calls. That's something that is still missing in the service mesh market. And another thing, I see service mesh and API gateway converging in the future. So where service mesh is a mesh, which means distributed enforcement, there are a lot of independent Envoy components that all talk to the same control plane. And if you use a product like, for example, Tetrate Service Bridge from Tetrate, then you have a centralized management plane that is able to do federation and to basically control all these distributed control planes. The same is going to happen for API gateways. And to make a very practical example, a lot of companies these days are hybrid or multi-cloud, which means they have at least some on-prem workloads and at least one public cloud, but often it is multi-public cloud workload. So another example, without naming the customer, it was a large online grocery shop, 100 development teams spread over 3 clouds, on-prem, Azure, and AWS, and they had one API gateway from one of the leading vendors, which I'm not going to name, API gateway vendors in the space, but they had a pure hub and spoke model. So customer data went through the API gateway and then to the backend services, but the backend services who were spread over 3 different clouds all had to go back to this single hosted hub and spoke API gateway to go back to a destination service. So that hub and spoke model no longer works. And that's why I'm seeing this API gateway functionality being distributed into the service mesh market as well. So I'm pretty confident that 3 or 5 years from now, API gateways and service meshes will be one and the same. You will have a distributed API gateway enforced in a service mesh style, and also being governed with a centralized dashboard with API developer portals. But it will no longer be a single point of failure and a single point of bottleneck. That's more or less.
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess for my sake, I'm trying to repeat it in my head. Security, obviously, as we're seeing as time goes by, it becomes paramount. I mean, there's so many breaches out there, and it's so foundational that it trumps everything else, right? But maybe a second one is, which helps us fight chaos, is I think back to my developer roots, we used to use the term convention over configuration, which basically is the same thing as uniformity, which is what you were saying, which is also tremendous. You know, the fact that you don't have to, every time you look at a dashboard, you have to interpret it because it's not uniform. It's different across every development team or what have you. And there's a great deal of value there, but that comes second. And that's, I think, a good segue to my next question, which is maybe a little more niche, but it's basically, maybe it's more of a reflection of my level of understanding at this stage, that Istio enables the ability to do things in a cross-cutting fashion. We can always use the term cross-cutting concern. And so we can ask ourselves, what are the cross-cutting the dimensions? So observability is one, security is another, authorization, which is part of security, of course, and the list goes on. And basically, that's what I'm sort of trying to envision as a future where every cross-cutting concern is a true one. There are many things we do at the application level that maybe we can sort of surface higher at and apply as a policy at the mesh level. And one of them is, I don't know why I was thinking or gravitating to authorization. But I can imagine that also being applied via policy to some extent. I mean, there are some things that are application specific. Is that easy to implement with Istio today? I know that there have been some development in that field. Like I was watching, for example, last year's IstioCon talks, and one of them talked about the introduction of external authorization plugin to the service mesh. So I think maybe it's coming bit by bit as people find gaps and they're contributing them back to the project, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an interesting question, and I'm actually working on a customer that has this similar requirement right now. So the core of a service mesh and the workloads with mutual TLSs like you have service-to-service authentication and authorization based on cryptographically enforced identities. But most of the applications that you deploy will have kind of an application, will have kind of a user notion, which is typically something expressed in job tokens or whatever, but there is like a double layer of authentication and authorization. So you have the machine-to-machine or the service-to-service security and which service is able to talk to that. But on top of that, you have like contextual authentication authorization element, and that's depending on which mobile browser is coming in or what mobile application user is coming in. And based on who he is or who he and she is, they are able to do other things. So there is like a kind of a double layer of other authentication and authorization. And that's what the external authorization endpoint is for. And the fact that Envoy is a sidecar and is able to extend that authorization and authentication and link that to OPA policies and whatever other policy engines that you have out there is a very strong is a very strong cutting concern. And to go back to why the customer that I'm currently working on has, for example, a lot of microservices, and they are built in JavaScript, Python, and Java. And they basically, over the last 4 or 5 years, have developed their own library. So they have to maintain that within 3 different languages. They have to maintain the development. And what does this library do? It generates job tokens and it distributes them. It fetches them. So if you develop as a library, as an application developer within that company, you have to use that library that will automatically fetch job tokens for you and validate them. And they want to get rid of that. They want to move that to the sidecar. And so that's
yes, a theme that I hear, I think we all hear in the industry for some time now, is this idea of making the work easier for developers. This goal of developers being able to focus on business logic. And maybe slowly we're getting there, right? The ops team is working hand in hand with them and saying, okay, you no longer have to do all of this work to achieve this end result. We can shrink it down for you. And that is valuable because it scales across multiple teams and so on. So there's economies of scale there.
Absolutely.
Okay, another sort of next question, and this has to do with maybe some of the details. About I want to say a month or 2 ago, I did an Istio weekly episode with Peter Yoshevitz from Tetrate, and in it I was waxing poetic a little bit about it. As I was comprehending, there's this almost duality between Istio and Envoy, almost like a yin and yang. One is control plane, the other one is data plane, and they each has a role, and they each interact in very well specified ways. It's really interesting to look at Envoy as a technology on its own, and it's got so much. It's hard to wrap your head around it. It's got so much. It's got a lot of filters that you can take advantage of, and maybe the hard part is curating all of these features into something that is easier to use at the level that the service mesh can actually exploit. And I suspect that maybe we're at a juncture where there's a gap right now. Maybe there are some filters that are in Envoy that are not yet configurable via Istio through custom resource definitions. Is there something that sticks out, and maybe something that maybe can be added to Istio in the future that can be exposed from Envoy?
So that's an interesting one. Because we all know, or most people are convinced that Envoy is a very flexible and very lightweight and a very high performant proxy, but it is so flexible that it can do so much that you have to safeguard what you expose in Istio. Because Istio on itself is already a beast to tame. It contains, I don't know out of the top of my head, but at least 10 or 15 CRDs, which you kind of need to know in order to build a decent distributed system. So there is, I think, within the Istio community, kind of this duality. Like they want to expose more, but if you expose too more, it becomes even more complex. And on the other hand, you only want to expose the bare minimum and then have some kind of a flexibility mechanism for people who want to go further, like the 80-20 rule, who want to go in that 20 rule to, for example, use an Envoy filter, or use a Wasm extension. So
Right.
that's,
I guess that's what you. Yeah, go ahead.
and so, for example, two things that I have seen in the past of that I have been asked, like, why don't you guys expose this as a CRD? Is one of them was traffic tapping or mirroring, and that's because I was quite heavily involved for the last 2 years in the service provider market as well, where 5G, the 5G core stack is completely containerized as well, and service mesh makes a lot of sense there as well. And traffic tapping being like, or traffic mirroring is an alternative name of it, is like the full body, so if it's an HTTP or a gRPC message, the full body and the headers all sent through a different interface for legal intercept, for integration with SIEM systems, etc. So that's something that's available in Envoy out of the box, but you can't do it directly in Istio. Another one would be protocol transformation. So a lot of people have this REST and gRPC. They might expose REST or GraphQL, which is another form of REST. And then internally they are using gRPC. So typically on the Istio Ingress gateway, they want to have that translation. Or you might also have vice versa in case you have like gRPC and REST-based services. You want to have this, let's say, protocol transformation between REST and gRPC services. These are just two random things. I don't have any.
Yeah.
I think if you go to the Istio GitHub,
we could find that.
A lot of questions, but like I said, this is like a balance.
Yeah, I can totally see that. That's true. There's a danger to sort of upsetting that balance. I feel like maybe my next question is not. It might have been obviated by everything I've heard so far, because I was going to ask you about. What is it about service mesh that makes you so driven and passionate about it? But I think everything we've touched on is maybe a testament to that. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about, to say it in your own words.
All right. So for me, a service mesh is to the security industry what two-factor authentication did when it developed itself, like 10, I don't know when the first two-factor authentication solution was out there, but let's say that around 10 to 15 years. That changed the industry for, let's say, user to machine or user to service authentication. We no longer had to only rely on our usernames and passwords, which we all know passwords are not safe. And you can have your password mechanisms to make them randomly, but still two-factor authentication changed the industry. All of a sudden, when you created a bank account at a new bank, you would receive a letter, you would receive a small box with a hardware device that would generate an OTP, a one-time password that's only valid during a certain window, and security increased a lot. Although there are still leaks and potential, and I mean, it's not 100% waterproof, but at least it did an enormous benefit to the security industry. And the same for me is service mesh. Like what I said, certificates are nothing new. They are out there for decades, but no one really ever got it right of having these certificates distributed to workloads. So for me, having these rotating certificates, which is almost kind of a one-time password thing, it's very similar, is extremely important. And the reason why, and I've said it before, the reason why it is so hot now is because containerization means workloads are moving. The fact that you're on Kubernetes means you no longer rely on IP addresses. So the whole firewall market, where you typically had layer 3, layer 4 security, being this IP and this TCP port is allowed to talk to this IP, and that TCP port, that's gone. It's all being replaced by identity-based security, identity based on certificates containing a triplet of a trust domain, a namespace, and a service account. And that's really powerful. So for me, it's really changing the security industry, in my opinion. And people that down tune the importance of service mesh, try it in another way. There are no other solutions on the market today that enforce security on layer 5, layer 7 in a ubiquitous, transparent way with automatic and cryptographically enforced identity. Service mesh is really the best solution. So that's why I believe in service mesh, and why I think it is changing the industry.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's pretty deep, and I think I can envision such a future, such an eventuality taking place. My final question is a little bit of something I reserve for myself, for my own needs, as we're launching these episodes, and my task will be to line up more guests and discuss more topics. And I really want to sort of your honest opinion. What do you think might be? Do you have any ideas of some topics or some people in the community that we should bring on the show and give them a voice and get to know them for the sake of our wider audience?
Yeah, what I would like to know. So we all know that the service mesh had its predecessor, or for people that don't know it, but a service mesh originally started, or the ideas or the concepts that are the foundation of a service mesh started at Netflix. So Netflix open source stack was a stack with things like Zoo for service for gateway service, Eureka as a service registry, and Ribbon as a REST client, and a lot of components written in Java at the time, if I'm not mistaken. All of that has now been shifted towards an infrastructure layer, like a common middleware based on Envoy. And I wonder how the hardcore development community looks at this, like the Spring Java community, because they all have their Zoo libraries, they have their own service discovery mechanism. So there is this kind of conflict between, let's say, the large software development ecosystems out there, whether they are JavaScript based or Java based or Golang or whatever. They all have their niche solution that does some part of what a service mesh does as well. So I would love to see how the development community, maybe somebody from the Java Spring community, looks at service mesh, because they have been building some of those things in their own little niche as well, and how they see do they see service mesh as a competition, or do they see yes, we can offload some of that and maybe potentially integrate with that? Because who says that a service mesh needs a sidecar? Maybe you can have a Spring Boot application which gets his certificates straight from istiod without a sidecar. So this kind of things that I would really love to know. There are some interesting...
It's interesting you say that, because I've been wondering that myself, primarily because I come from that world. I've spent a lot of time. I used to do instruction for Pivotal. Pivotal is the steward of the Spring framework, which is now VMware. And you all stay tuned. There's a special guest that we're going to be bringing on, who's a rock star in the Java world. We're still trying to nail down the scheduling and so on. But yeah, I used to teach Spring Cloud Netflix. There's a lot of has been invested in sort of productionalizing a lot of the amazing tech that came out of Netflix, and I think that would be a great topic for conversation. So you're getting the gears in my mind going. So thank you so much. Well, Bart, this is all I have. I think maybe we're gonna wrap up the conversation. For our audience, thank you for attending. I hope you found this interesting. And before we say goodbye, I guess the last thing I want to sort of remind everyone is you're welcome to engage us. We have our Tetrate community Slack, which I'm sort of showing here in the screen that I'm sharing. If you have any questions or anything, any follow-up or even suggestions, and it doesn't have to be there strictly. It can also be on our corresponding GitHub repo. Feel free to file an issue here, and this could be a proposal form if you want to contact us and talk to us or whatever it may be. Reach out to us. So thank you again for your time, and thank you, Bart, for this great interview. And everybody, we'll see you next week for our next episode, which has yet to be announced. All right. Well, bye, everybody, and we'll see you next week.